701 BC, the armies of Assyria invaded Judah and placed a siege around the fortified Judean city of Lachish. Lachish was strategically situated in the foothills southwest of Jerusalem.
From the walls of the elevated city, it was possible to see directly from here to the hills near Jerusalem, as well as to other cities in the Judean line of defense, such as Azekah.
In addition to the biblical accounts in 2 Kings 18 and 2 Chronicles 32, the conquest of Lachish is depicted in monumental stone reliefs found at Nineveh at the palace of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The Assyrian attackers built a ramp up to the wall so they could bring their battering ram near. The defenders inside built their own ramp, raising the height of the wall. This forced the Assyrians to raise their ramp even higher before they could capture the city.
In that same year, 701, the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem. King Hezekiah of Judah could not resist their assault and agreed to send a very heavy tribute payment to Assyria. Only then did the invading army leave Judah. The city of Lachish was later rebuilt, on a smaller scale, by King Josiah. However, in the year 597, the land was again invaded, this time by the Babylonians. Lachish was once again destroyed.
In the gatehouse of the city, archaeologists found the famous Lachish letters. These letters are the remains of the correspondence between the commander of the city of Lachish and an unidentified Judean outpost at the time of the Babylonian invasion. As King Nebuchadnezzar's army advanced towards Lachish, the unknown outpost commander wrote, "We are watching for the signals of Lachish according to all the indications which you gave, sir, for we cannot see the signal fire of Azekah." Jeremiah 34:7 records that Azekah and Lachish were the last cities to fall to the Babylonians before they laid siege to Jerusalem.
Many ancient cities were surrounded by a high wall for protection. An attacking army could try to go over the top of the fortifications using ladders. Sometimes they attempted to go through the wall by chopping away with instruments such as hammers or axes, or by breaking or burning the city gate. Frequently, however, penetration through the wall was accomplished with a battering ram. This was a heavy log that was pounded repeatedly against the gate or against one spot in the wall until the wall or gate collapsed. In order to make it more difficult to bring such heavy equipment up close to the walls, cities were sometimes built at the top of a steep slope. The attackers would then have to build a ramp that made it possible for them to move their siege equipment up to the walls.
Penetration from below usually meant the long process of digging a tunnel under the wall. Sometimes, however, it was possible to use an existing tunnel, such as the shaft that connected the city to its water supply. According to 2 Samuel 5:8, David's general Joab captured Jerusalem through such a shaft.
Defenders of a city were equally ingenious in finding methods to neutralize the efforts of the attacking army. Ladders were pushed over, second walls were built behind a first wall that was about to fall, large stones or even fire could be thrown down on attackers who got close to the wall. In order to protect soldiers working or attacking near the wall, the attacking army would build a kind of large shield that covered the soldiers from above. This device is mentioned by the prophet Nahum when he says, "The attackers rushed to the wall and set up a shield for the battering ram." According to 2 Kings 17, after the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel at the end of the 8th century BC, they uprooted the Jewish population and took many of them to different parts of the Assyrian Empire. At the same time, the Assyrians brought a mixture of peoples from other countries they had conquered. The Jews never considered these people to be part of the nation of Israel. Because they were settled in a region whose capital city was Samaria, they are known in some ancient texts as Samaritans. The city of Samaria stood on a hill near Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Ezra chapter 4 says that the Samaritans opposed the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and its temple. The contemporary prophets Haggai and Zechariah do not mention this, and it may simply reflect the conditions in the time of Nehemiah. It is possible that the Samaritans built their own temple sometime during the 4th century BC, although no remains have been found. Some sources speak of its destruction in 128 BC. At the time of the New Testament, there was no temple on Mount Gerizim. Samaritans were looked down on by the Jews, and there was relatively little contact between the two peoples. The Samaritans have survived in small numbers in 2 areas of Israel until today. They keep many ancient customs and have preserved their own ancient text of the 5 books of Moses. King Josiah of Judah is well known for his sweeping religious reforms. He centralized the worship of the Lord in Jerusalem and destroyed all the places of worship in the areas surrounding Jerusalem where cults had been practiced, such as here in the Valley of Gehenna. These cults combined elements of various religions. Such a combined religious form is called syncretistic.
In former times, each village or town had its special cult place or bamah, where the people held their sacrificial meals and other rituals. The Hebrew word bamah is a generic term for a sanctuary or place of sacrifice. While it sometimes has positive connotations before the building of the temple in 1 Kings 8, after that event, the editor of 1 Kings generally condemns such cult places as illegitimate. The Lord should be worshipped only in Jerusalem.
King Josiah ordered that the temple be repaired. While this was being carried out, the workers found a scroll, which the text of 2 Kings calls the Book of the Law. Most scholars agree that this scroll contained a great part of the book of Deuteronomy. Josiah published the scroll by having it read aloud to a large assembly of men of Judah and Israel. The scroll proclaimed that the Lord had chosen one place where he would reside and where he would receive sacrifice. Following this dramatic discovery, Josiah reformed the religion of Israel in accordance with the rules laid down in this book of the covenant. After the fall of the Assyrian Empire, some time passed before the Babylonians were able to establish their authority in Syria, Phoenicia, and Canaan. The Egyptians took advantage of the situation and made attempts to reassert their own influence in those areas. In 609 BC, the Egyptian king Necho came up from Egypt with a large army. He wanted to establish power bases north of Israel. He asked King Josiah of Judah for permission to pass through Judah and Israel, but Josiah refused and went out against him with his small army. It was a fatal mistake. Josiah was defeated here at Megiddo. He himself was wounded in that battle, and he died later of his wounds in Jerusalem. The prophet Jeremiah had supported King Josiah in his religious reform program and counseled him not to ally himself with Egypt against Babylon. Jeremiah tried to give similar advice to a later king, Zedekiah. This king did not appreciate his advice and had the prophet thrown into a prison, which was actually a cistern under the ground. Jeremiah viewed the political events of his time as being controlled by God. He saw the pending Babylonian invasion as a punishment from God, and spoke out strongly against resisting the Babylonians or even concluding alliances against Babylon with Egypt and other states. Nevertheless, kings of Judah after Josiah did ally themselves with Egypt against the rising power of Babylon. This would lead to the downfall of Judah. In 597 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah. Either then or in the later invasion in 587, he had attacked this city of Lachish, which had been rebuilt on a smaller scale by King Josiah after its destruction by the Assyrians. The Babylonians ruled over the land of Israel for less than 60 years, but it was a period of great importance in Israelite history, especially in the spiritual and intellectual development of the Jewish community that had been exiled to Babylon.
Babylon was a very large and beautiful city. Its main ziggurat, or Tower of Babel, the city wall, and the palace of Nebuchadnezzar became legends. It was a city full of temples, devoted to the great gods of the Babylonians. Among these, the most important were the sun god Shamash, the moon god Sin, Ishtar, the goddess of love and fertility, also known as the Queen of Heaven, Adad, the god of storms and rain and warfare, and Marduk, the national god, protector of the city and its king.
The Babylonian gods were represented by golden statues inlaid with diamonds. These were kept hidden away in the temples where they were washed, fed, entertained, and generally cared for by the priests. Only once a year were they brought out of the temples where the common people could see them. They were driven on chariots from the temples down to the river.
The specially prepared route was called the processional way. It was a beautiful thoroughfare, reserved for gods only. Going to and from the river, the procession passed through the magnificent Ishtar Gate. On the gate, people could see images of the gods Adad and Marduk. Marduk was symbolized by a dragon, an animal with the head of a snake, the tail of a scorpion, the hind legs of an eagle, and the front legs of a lion. Adad, the weather god, is represented by a bull, symbol of vitality and unpredictability. On the walls were lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar.
In Isaiah chapter 40, which most scholars consider to have been written in a Babylonian context, we find the words of an unknown prophet, sometimes referred to as Second Isaiah. "Prepare a road for the Lord in the wilderness. Clear the way for our God in the desert. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it."
The God of Israel will travel on a specially prepared highway, and everyone will be able to watch. The highway also becomes a way back home for the exiles, across the desert from Babylon to Jerusalem. The processional way in Babylon may have provided the setting for this vision. But for the prophet, the glory of God will not be revealed by showing off gold statues, but rather in the liberation and return of the Jewish exiles.
Another prophet who lived among the Jewish captives in Babylon was Ezekiel. He delivered his prophecies in the early years of the captivity. In one prophecy, he described an ideal temple that would be built one day to replace the one the Babylonians had destroyed. In a vision, Ezekiel was brought to Jerusalem, where he watched as a man with a measuring reed measured the dimensions of the new temple. This reed that I'm using is about the length of the one in Ezekiel's vision. The Neo-Babylonian Empire did not last long. Babylon fell quite suddenly in the year 539, probably as the result of collaboration between some of the Babylonian elite with the Persian enemy. Cyrus, king of Persia, entered Babylon on October 30th of that year. He was seen by many as a liberator. In the book of Isaiah, he's referred to as the one the Lord has anointed, God's instrument for the liberation of the captives.
Cyrus worshipped Ahura Mazda as supreme god and his personal protector. This god is not mentioned in the Bible. On many statues and reliefs of Persian kings, above the head of the king is depicted a winged solar disk with a human head and the claws of a bird. Most scholars agree that this emblem represents Ahura Mazda.
After conquering the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Cyrus defeated Croesus, the king of Lydia in Asia Minor, and captured all the legendary treasures of the Lydian kingdom. When Cyrus died, his empire covered the area of present-day Iran, Mesopotamia, Phoenicia and the land of Israel, and all of Asia Minor with its prosperous Greek cities like Ephesus and Miletus. He was buried in Pasargadae in the land of his clan, the Achaemenids. By 525, Cyrus' son Cambyses had taken control of all of the Fertile Crescent and extended this enormous empire from Ethiopia all the way to the Indus River at the edge of present-day India. The world had never seen such a large empire. It was much larger than the earlier empires of the Assyrians and Babylonians. The Persians would hold power for almost 200 years.
For most of the year, the Persian king resided in the city of Susa, where the story of Esther is set. In the summer months, the king escaped the extreme heat of Susa and lived in the city of Ecbatana in the Zagros Mountains, some 600 kilometers northeast of Susa. According to a later tradition, Esther and Mordecai were buried in Ecbatana. The site of the ancient city is today mostly covered by the modern city of Hamadan.
Ecbatana was the ancient capital of the Medes, a tribe related to the Persians. They had become a powerful nation during the last years of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The mother of Cyrus the Great was the daughter of one of the kings of Media. Cyrus had united the Persians and Medes into a powerful federation. The Medes and the Persians were originally migrating nomads. During the winter months, they lived with their sheep and cattle in the lower regions, while in summertime they moved with their flocks up into the mountains.
The area around the city of Susa was inhabited by the Elamites. Elam had been a powerful nation in the 2nd millennium BC. The culture of the Elamites resembled the cultures of Mesopotamia. The ziggurat near Susa, now being restored, bears witness to the ancient roots of the Elamites. Archaeologists are still uncovering this ancient culture. The Elamites were also united in the Persian Federation, and together with the Medes formed the backbone of the Persian power structure.
It was customary for Persian kings to erect huge statues of themselves as a symbol of their power and glory. The book of Daniel records that King Darius II required his subjects to worship such a statue. When Daniel refused, he was thrown into a pit where lions were kept.
Persian kings often kept a private zoo. The den of lions could have been somewhere near the palace.
The Persians organized their empire into states, which they called satrapies. Each state had its own governor or satrap. Judah was part of the satrapy across the river Euphrates. From the books of Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and the later prophets, we can conclude that there were Jewish communities in the various centers of the Persian Empire. Their conditions changed over time. The book of Daniel shows that Jewish nobility served at the court, and on one occasion a Jewish girl, Esther, became one of the wives of the King of Kings. The stories of Daniel and Esther are not confirmed by sources outside the Bible. Nevertheless, we do know that it was the policy of Eastern rulers that the nobility of the peoples of the empire could serve in the court of the king. It is possible, then, that Daniel did serve in the courts of the last Babylonian ruler and 3 Persian kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius.
Darius the Great built a new palace complex, Persepolis, in the heartland of Persia. There he gathered all the treasures that had been captured by Persian armies in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Phoenicia, and Asia Minor. The city of Persepolis was really the treasure chamber of the world at that time. Its luxury and beauty were legendary. When Alexander the Great captured Persepolis, he needed a large number of mules and 3,000 camels to carry off the treasures, which included 4 million kilograms of silver.
Persepolis was built for a very special purpose, the celebration of the New Year festival. Every year at the end of February, with the approach of spring, the king traveled from Susa to Persepolis. On the 21st of March, he performed a number of rituals that symbolized the death of the deadly powers of winter and the victory of the powers of life. Astronomers would indicate with great precision at what time the king was to perform the rites of the new year. We find in the audience halls of the palace many reliefs that show a lion representing spring killing a bull which represents winter.
On the occasion of the New Year festival, all the subject nations of the Persian Empire would send to the great king gifts and other signs of their loyalty. On the walls of the audience hall are pictured peoples of different cultures and races, from the Indians near the Indus River to the Ethiopians in Africa. Each nation can be recognized by its hairstyle and clothing. The Medes with their short robes are always in the forefront, as their nobility served together with the Persian nobles as the core of the king's civil servants.
The Persians did not bury their dead, but exposed the bodies of the dead on the rocks, where the flesh was eaten by birds. The remaining bones were gathered and placed in rock tombs. Not far from Persepolis we find the rock tombs of 4 Persian kings, believed to be the tombs of Darius I, Darius II the Great, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes.
Xerxes, who is called Ahasuerus in the Hebrew Bible, reigned from 485 until 465 BC. He was the king who married Esther. Xerxes is known in history as the Persian king who waged war with the Greek city-states and sacked the famous Acropolis in Athens. He was finally defeated by the Greeks.
About a year after Cyrus' victory over the Babylonians, he had decreed that the Jewish exiles could return to their land and rebuild their temple. They were allowed to take with them the sacred objects that had been removed from Jerusalem by the Babylonians. However, the rebuilding of the temple was delayed. 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, strongly exhorted the people and their leaders to finish the job of building, but it had only been completed in about the year 515 by Zerubbabel. He had brought back a larger group from exile about 5 years before. The rebuilt temple was small and not very impressive. Significant events in the next stage of Israel's history center around the activities of 2 men, Ezra and Nehemiah. They were active in the last half of the 5th century BC, although the exact chronological relationship between the 2 of them is uncertain. Ezra received permission from the Persian king to administer the law of God and to train the Jews in that law. Ezra led a 3rd, smaller group of exiles back to the land. Ezra undertook wide-ranging social reform, including the condemnation of mixed marriages between Jewish men and non-Jewish women. The basis for Ezra's reform was the Pentateuch, or Law of Moses. Ezra is generally credited with extensive work on the text of the law, especially the book of Deuteronomy. He may also have written the books of Chronicles.
The walls of Jerusalem had been heavily damaged or destroyed by the Babylonians. For close to 150 years they lay in disrepair. Nehemiah, a personal servant of the Persian king, received permission to rebuild the walls. The book of Nehemiah describes how the walls were rebuilt in only 52 days, in the face of considerable opposition from non-Jewish neighbors. Because of the speed and the opposition, the walls were not very solid or impressive. The course of the wall is given in some detail by Nehemiah, and several of its parts have been uncovered.
The scriptures call Ezra a priest and a scribe. While the title scribe later came to describe a person who was an authority in the scriptures, at first it simply indicated a person who copied texts, a kind of secretary to important people.
Societies need to keep records. Writing systems were first developed more than 5,000 years ago by the Sumerians. They used a pointed reed to make impressions on soft clay tablets. This is called cuneiform script. Sometimes the same script was chiseled into stone surfaces.
The Egyptians designed a different system of writing called hieroglyphics. It was based on small pictures representing objects, groups of sounds, and individual sounds. There were several hundred such hieroglyphic signs, and it would have been difficult to learn them all. This meant that only a few specially educated priests were able to write or read.
Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, a vital step forward in writing came from Canaan. A separate sign or letter was designed for each consonantal sound. This was the first alphabet. This great invention was gradually adapted by many different cultures as the writing system for their respective languages.
Two main materials were used for written documents, paper and parchment. Paper was made from the papyrus plant, which was harvested in the Nile Delta in Egypt. The raw material was taken from the tall plants, which may grow to more than 10 meters. The green outer rind was peeled off with a knife, and the inner pith was sliced into thin strips, which were rolled with a rolling pin against a flat surface. The rolled strips were cut to the required length. The sheet of papyrus was made by arranging parallel strips in a kind of lattice work, with horizontal and vertical layers which were pressed together. The sheet that was formed was covered on both sides with felt and then dried in a press.
Papyrus fragments, including some Old Testament biblical texts, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the ancient library of the Qumran community in the Judean desert. Hundreds of papyrus fragments from copies of the New Testament have also survived. Some of them can be dated as early as the 2nd century AD. The word Bible derives from the name of the Phoenician port city of Byblos, which was famous for the export of papyrus.
Parchment was made from animal skin, specially prepared by removing the hair and stretching the skin thin. It was then smoothed with lime, making it very pliable and durable. Parchment scrolls were stronger and longer lasting than papyrus. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide first-hand evidence of the ancient scribal technique of preparing and writing on parchment. Most of the scrolls found at Qumran were of parchment, including the complete scroll of Isaiah, dating from the 1st century BC.
A scroll was a long strip made by sewing together sheets of papyrus or parchment. An unrolled scroll was often about 10 meters or 33 feet in length. This strip was then rolled up from one end or from both ends to form one or two cylinders. The ends of the scroll were often attached to sticks, making it easier to roll up.
Normally, scribes wrote only on one side of the scroll, although Ezekiel 2:10 describes a roll written on both front and back, with words of lamentation, mourning, and woe.
The codex, or bound book, with individual pages, only came into use in the 1st century BC, and into common use only a century or two later. Thus, all references to books in the Old Testament, in the Deuterocanon, and probably in the New Testament, are to scrolls, and not to bound books.
If a letter or document was to be sent somewhere, it was tied shut and then sealed. The seal was made of melted wax or of clay. Into the soft wax or clay, the sender made an impression with a signet ring or a special device for marking a seal. When the clay or wax hardened, the scroll was carried by a messenger. The seal had to be broken before the document could be read.
For writing on a scroll, one normally used a pen made from a reed. Its end was split to form a nib to enable it to hold more ink. The end of the pen was dipped in water and then rubbed on a block of dried ink. This made a small amount of liquid ink on the end of the pen. With this, the scribe wrote a few letters before repeating the process. Ezekiel chapter 9 mentions a special writing case for carrying several pens and a cake of dried ink.
Small amounts of non-permanent text could be written on a flat tablet, normally made of wood. This was coated on one side with a thin layer of wax. A pointed stick or stylus was used to make marks and letters in the wax layer. The wax could be smoothed out and used again. While most Old Testament references are figurative, some passages may refer to tablets made of clay, metal, or stone. Words were scratched onto these with a hard, pointed object.
For several centuries, the Persians had been engaged in occasional warfare with the Greeks. While each side sometimes managed to advance into the territory of the other, much of this warfare took place in Asia Minor, a large, fertile area that stood between the two warring nations.
Between 334 and 323 BC, Alexander, the king of Macedon and northern Greece, launched a series of daring campaigns into all corners of the Persian Empire. He defeated the Persian armies repeatedly and gained control over their entire empire.
When Alexander entered Persepolis, he allowed his soldiers to plunder the houses of the rich people who lived there. This was in retaliation for the earlier Persian sacking of the Acropolis in Athens, and it was the first time in the long campaign that Alexander allowed such plundering. It was generally his aim to win the popular support of the Persian peoples and be recognized as a legitimate ruler and not just a foreign conqueror. During Alexander's stay in Persepolis, fire broke out and destroyed the magnificent private palace of the Persian kings. Historians still debate whether the fire was the result of a deliberate action or a mere accident.
Among Alexander's conquests was the kingdom of Judah. After his death in 323, his empire was divided among his four top generals. The kingdom of Judah at first came under the control of the Ptolemies in Egypt. At the beginning of the 3rd century BC, the Seleucid armies from Syria defeated the Ptolemies at a place called Panion and took control of Judah. The 11th chapter of the book of Daniel describes many of the events surrounding this period. Alexander's conquest was not only military, but also cultural. His soldiers founded cities in the areas they conquered. These cities had the effect of spreading Alexander's beloved Greek culture to the far reaches of his empire. This played an important role in the process known as Hellenism, from the name for Greece, Hellas. One of the most significant consequences of the spread of Hellenistic culture was the replacement of Aramaic by Koine Greek as the language of trade and international communication. Koine Greek is the language in which the New Testament would be written.
The New Testament several times mentions cities of the Decapolis. These were Hellenistic cities.
Gerasa was one of the cities of the Decapolis. These were 10 Roman cities that shared a Hellenistic culture. Most of them were to the east of the Jordan River. 2 were farther north in Syria, and 1 was in Israel to the west of the Jordan. In the Gospels, it is said that Jesus visited cities of the Decapolis.
Certain institutions were characteristic of a Hellenistic city or polis. As in Judaism, education was given highest priority in Hellenistic culture. The place for formal education was in the gymnasium. Here teachers taught the young men a variety of subjects, ranging from language and literature to law and music. The students also participated naked in sports such as wrestling and athletics.
Scattered around the city, one would find temples dedicated to various Greek gods and goddesses. The city of Gerasa had this temple to the goddess Artemis.
A hippodrome was a large open structure in the shape of an oval. Here, the citizens of the Hellenistic city watched horse races or chariot races. The theater was a popular Hellenistic institution that was introduced into the land only in the Roman period. Some theaters were quite large. This one in the Decapolis city of Scythopolis could seat about 7,000 people.
A number of New Testament words reflect the vocabulary of the theater. One of these is the word hypocrites, often transliterated as hypocrite. It was one of the words for an actor on the stage.
Older Canaanite or Israelite towns normally showed little evidence of city planning. They simply conformed to the topography and expanded as people added one house to another. Hellenistic cities, on the other hand, were often laid out systematically, especially in the Roman period. The main street was called the Cardo, as we can see one behind me here. It could be lined with columns on both sides and was the location of administrative buildings and shops, which were often decorated with elaborate mosaic floors. Carts drawn by animals left ruts in the paving stones.
Near the center of the city there was normally an open space called the Agora. Here the market was set up for buying and selling or bartering agricultural produce, clothing, and other manufactured goods. Public meetings of the citizens could also be held in the agora, and teachers sometimes used the covered area around its outer edge, called a stoa, as a place to instruct their students.
In the year 168 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV made an official effort to suppress certain Jewish practices, as he had done with other local religions in his kingdom. Led by one of the priestly families, the Jews rebelled. This Maccabean revolt, as it is called, is described in the deuterocanonical books of the Maccabees and in part in Daniel chapter 11. The rebellion succeeded, and for about 100 years, the Jews were sovereign in the land. The 2nd century BC saw the rise of several sectarian movements in Judaism, including the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. Near the end of the 2nd century, the Jews expanded their territory, conquering Samaria and later Idumea, formerly known as Edom, where the inhabitants were forced to convert to Judaism. King Herod the Great was descended from these converted Idumeans. Jewish rule in the land continued until 63, when the Romans established themselves in the region. Judea was added to the Roman province of Syria, bringing to an end a century of Jewish sovereignty in the land.